They found her at 0340 hours. And the first thing anyone noticed wasn't the wound on her temple or the hypothermia that had turned her fingers the color of old wax. It was the rifle. She had her arms around it, the way a person holds something they've decided to die for. The rescue crew out of Pensacola hadn't expected to find anyone alive. The distress beacon had been transmitting for 11 hours before the signal was strong enough to triangulate, and 11 hours in the Gulf of Mexico in February, with water temperatures sitting at 51 degrees Fahrenheit, was not a window a human body survives. Physiologically speaking, the math doesn't work. Core temperature drops roughly 1 degree Celsius for every 30 minutes of cold water immersion without protection. By hour 4, most people are unconscious. By hour 6, cardiac arrest becomes not a possibility but a probability. By hour 11, you're not looking for a survivor, you're recovering a body. Petty Officer Dale Sutter, the crew chief on the HH-60 Jayhawk that pulled her from the water, later told investigators he thought she was dead when they hoisted her up. She wasn't moving, her lips were the color of concrete, and she still hadn't let go of the rifle. She let go of nothing, in fact, until they had her aboard and strapped to a litter, and even then it wasn't voluntary. Her muscles had locked around the weapon with the kind of grip that only comes from long unconsciousness in the cold. The hands freeze in whatever position they held last, and they hold that position until the tissue warms. It took 2 of his crew members 4 minutes to carefully separate her fingers from the stock without tearing skin. Sutter said he'd done 11 years of search and rescue. He said he'd seen a lot of things come up out of the water. He'd never seen anything like that rifle. The woman had no identification on her. That was the first fact that landed on Commander Bridget Hagen's desk at Naval Air Station Pensacola, and it sat there like a stone for the better part of an hour before she knew what to do with it. No ID card, no dog tags, no phone, no wallet, no unit patch, no rank insignia. The wetsuit she'd been wearing was military grade, but had been stripped of all markings, manufacturer tags cut out, Velcro attachment points bare. The boots were similarly clean. Even the laces were unremarkable. The rifle was not unremarkable. Hagen was not a small arms specialist. She knew enough to recognize the platform, a modified bolt action in a chassis she didn't immediately place, with a barrel length that suggested it had not been designed for any standard military application. The suppressor housing at the muzzle was integrated, not threaded on. The scope was something she'd never seen on any issued weapon. And along the underside of the stock, running the full length of the grip, there was a seam that should not have existed on any rifle she'd encountered in 22 years of service. She photographed it from 6 angles and sent the images to 3 different people before she even called the hospital to ask about the woman's condition. The woman was alive. That was the word from the ER attending, a Dr. Renata Solberg. Alive was a relative term. Her core temperature on arrival had been 29.2 degrees Celsius. That placed her in the severe hypothermia category, which the textbooks define as below 30 degrees. Below 28, the heart becomes electrically unstable. She had been close. She had been, in the attending physician's words, about 45 minutes from a point of no return, and the only reason she was still inside that window was that the cold had slowed her metabolism enough to slow everything else, including her body's own deterioration. It was the cold that had been trying to kill her. It was also, paradoxically, the cold that had kept her alive long enough to be found. She hadn't regained consciousness. Her hands, when the nurses warmed them, kept trying to close around something that wasn't there. Hagen stood outside the ICU window and watched the monitors and thought about the rifle in the secured room down the hall. And she thought about the seam along the stock. And she thought about all the things a person might carry into the Gulf of Mexico that they weren't supposed to have. And she thought about the fact that someone had gone to considerable effort to make sure no one could identify this woman. She thought about whether that effort had been made by the woman herself or by someone else. The name came 47 hours later, and it didn't come from the woman. It came from a fingerprint match that ran through 3 federal databases before it hit something that flagged the request and generated an automatic notification to a classified distribution list that Haugen didn't have visibility on. She knew it had happened because two men arrived at NAS Pensacola at 0615 on a Tuesday morning without prior coordination, without notifying the base commanding officer, and without explaining to anyone exactly what agency or office they represented. They asked to see the rifle first. Hagen didn't let them. She was not, by nature or by rank, someone who pushed back against men in civilian clothes, arriving with federal credentials and quiet authority. She had spent her career learning when to press and when to step back, and she had made commander by understanding that distinction more clearly than most. But there was something about the order of operations, the rifle before the patient, the equipment before the human being, that made something in her go very still. She told them the rifle was secured and that access required documentation she hadn't yet received. She told them they were welcome to wait in the conference room adjacent to the medical wing and that she would personally ensure any coordination happened through proper channels. One of the men, older, with the particular kind of stillness that comes from years of practice, looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he said, "Her name is Reva Strand." The name meant nothing to Hagen. It meant a great deal to Master Chief Petty Officer Carl Vetch, who was the ranking enlisted advisor at the installation and who had, before his current assignment, spent 6 years attached to Naval Special Warfare Command. When Hagen mentioned the name to him later that afternoon, casually, as if she hadn't already spent 4 hours running every search she had access to, he went quiet in a way that told her it meant something. He said the name wasn't one he could place exactly. She said she wasn't asking him to place it exactly. He said he'd heard it once, maybe twice, in conversations that weren't the kind of conversations you wrote down. Hagen let that sit. Then she said, "What kind of conversations?" Vetch looked at the window for a moment. Then he said, "The kind where someone is being discussed not as a person, but as a capability." Reva Strand was 34 years old. She had enlisted at 19, tested into a signals intelligence role at 21, and then largely disappeared from any record that Hagen could access. There were fragments, a marksmanship score from her initial training that the evaluating officer had flagged as anomalous and submitted for review. A series of reassignments in the middle years that traced no clear geographic or organizational logic. A medical record that was mostly redacted, with visible entries suggesting multiple deployments in environments where the temperatures were either very high or very low. There was a psychological evaluation from 7 years ago that had been partially declassified, and the evaluating officer's summary contained one sentence that Hagen read 3 times. Subject demonstrates an unusual capacity for sustained precision under conditions of extreme physical and psychological stress, and appears to perform better, not worse, under direct threat to her own safety. Hagen read that and looked up at the ceiling and thought about a woman holding a rifle in 51-degree water for 11 hours. Then she read the line again. The psychological evaluation noted something else. Reva Strand had a particular relationship with numbers, not in the idiosyncratic way that word is sometimes used, not a quirk or an affectation, but in the way a person uses a language they learned before they learned to speak. She processed ballistic variables the way other people processed color or sound, instinctively, without apparent effort, in ways that could not be fully explained by formal training alone. Her instructors had noted it, her commanders had noted it. At some point, someone had decided it was useful. The evaluating officer had written, almost as an afterthought, in the margin of the final page in handwriting rather than typed text. "She told me she doesn't calculate the shot. She said, the shot is already there. She just has to be still enough to find it." She regained consciousness on the morning of the 3rd day. The nurses noted that she didn't wake the way most people do, gradually through stages of confusion and disorientation. She came up out of unconsciousness like a system rebooting. Eyes open, immediate assessment of the room, immediate assessment of the door, immediate questions spoken clearly and without any of the hoarseness you'd expect from 71 hours of intubation. "Where is the rifle?" The attending nurse, a young man named Colby Ferris, who had been on shift for 6 hours and had been briefed that the patient was a sensitive matter, said the rifle was secure and that she shouldn't worry about it. Strand looked at him and said, "That wasn't what I asked." Ferris found Hagen. Hagen came to the room and stood in the doorway. and the two women looked at each other across the antiseptic space of the ICU, and Haugen had the distinct and unsettling impression that Strand was evaluating her with the same precision she apparently applied to everything else. Haugen said, "The rifle is in a secured room 60 feet down this hallway. I have personally ensured that no one has accessed it, examined it, or moved it since you were brought in." Strand held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then she said, "You have access to this base's security logs?" Haugen said yes. Strand said, "I want to see them, all of them. Every access record for every secured area on this installation for the last 72 hours. Haugen said, "I can do that." Strand said, "And I want to know who asked about the rifle before they asked about me." Haugen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a good question," Strand said. "I know. The seam along the stock opened with a specific sequence of pressure points, 3 locations, applied in order, with a pause of approximately 2 seconds between each. Haugen watched Strand demonstrate this from the hospital bed, walking her through the process verbally, because her hands weren't yet steady enough to do it herself. And Haugen's hands were, and Strand needed her to be the one who opened it. Not the 2 men in civilian clothes, who were still waiting in the conference room. Not the base commanding officer, who had been notified at 0700 and had not yet asked Haugen directly about the rifle. Haugen. Inside the stock, in a cavity machined with tolerances that suggested this had been a design specification and not a modification, there was a data module the size of a pack of playing cards. It was sealed in a waterproof housing. There was no external port visible, no USB connection, no charging indicator, no manufacturer marking of any kind. Strand told her how to find the release mechanism. Haugen found it. The module came out in her hand. Strand looked at it from the bed and said, "That has been in the water with me for 71 hours. The housing is rated to 300 meters depth and 7 days submersion. It is intact." Haugen said, "What's on it?" Strand was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you know what a ghost contract is?" Haugen said she wasn't sure. Strand said, "It's a procurement vehicle that exists inside the defense budget as a line item with a classification level, high enough that most oversight bodies can't access it. It looks from the outside like a legitimate special access program. It has a project name, a funding allocation, a contracting officer of record. Everything is correct on paper." Haugen waited. Strand said, "The money doesn't go to what the line item says it goes to. It goes somewhere else. And the contracting officer of record doesn't know that, because the contracting officer of record is real. They're a real person with real credentials, but the signature on the disbursement authorizations is not theirs. It was never theirs." Haugen looked at the module in her hand. She said, "How many contracts?" Strand said, 23, across 4 fiscal years. The total disbursement is approximately $900 million. The room was quiet. Haugen said, "And who does it go to?" Strand said, "A network. It's not one person and it's not one organization. It's a web of shell entities, some domestic, some not. Some of the people receiving disbursements are private contractors who don't know they're inside the web. They're receiving legitimate subcontract payments from entities that are themselves laundering money. Some of them know exactly what they're part of." She paused. She said, "Some of them have names you would recognize. They had tried to kill her 11 days before Sutter's crew pulled her from the Gulf." She said this without drama, in the same tone she might use to describe a navigational correction or a weather change, factual, precise, carrying no more emotional weight than the information itself required. Haugen had come to understand over 3 days of careful conversation that this was not suppression. It was not bravado. It was something more structural. Strand processed events the way she processed ballistics, stripping them down to variables and conditions and probable outcomes, removing everything that didn't bear on what needed to happen next. What had happened was this. She had spent 14 months building the record on the module, not as an official investigation. There was no official investigation, because the program she had identified was designed specifically to prevent any official investigation from reaching the right documents. She had done it as what she called a parallel construction, working backward from anomalies she'd encountered in a legitimate assignment, following threads that led into places she didn't have authorization to access and accessing them anyway through methods she declined to specify in detail. She had done it alone. That was not pride in her voice when she said it. It was an acknowledgement of constraint. There was no one she could bring in without risking the record. Every person she might have told was potentially inside the network or connected to someone inside it. The network had been built, she said, with exactly that in mind, with the relationships and the access required to neutralize any internal threat before it became external. She had been carrying the weight of $900 million of documented fraud for 14 months, and she had told no one. When she finally had enough to be confident the record was complete, when she was certain the documentation was sufficient to survive any attempt to discredit it, she had gone to a single person she believed she could trust, a senior officer she had worked with years before in a different context, under different circumstances. She had told him what she had. Within 36 hours, she was on a boat in the Gulf of Mexico that she hadn't chosen to be on, and the two men who were supposed to be transporting her to a handoff location were not transporting her anywhere. She had gone into the water because the alternative was not going into the water. She had the rifle because she had not let them take it from her before she went, the rifle and the module inside it. Hagen spent a long time sitting with that. The physics of what Strand had survived were not technically impossible. They were merely at the outermost boundary of what human physiology permits under the worst conditions. 51-degree water, 11 hours, severe hypothermia that had come within 45 minutes of killing her and had instead preserved her by slowing everything down to the minimum required for continuation. The rifle, in the water with her, had given her something to hold. That was not a small thing. The literature on cold water survival is clear on the psychological dimension. People who have something to hold, something to protect, something that requires them to keep functioning, survive at higher rates than people who have only themselves. The body follows the mind, and the mind follows purpose, and purpose requires an object. She had held the rifle and the module inside it for 11 hours in 51-degree water, and she had not let go. Hagen thought about the two men who were still waiting in the conference room. She thought about the senior officer Strand had trusted, and she thought about what it meant that Strand had spent 14 months certain she could trust no one, and had finally chosen one person, and had been in the water 36 hours later. She thought about the base commanding officer, who had been notified at Eero 700 and had still not asked her directly about the rifle. She thought about who had generated the fingerprint notification. She thought about who was on the distribution list that notification had reached. She thought about whether the two men in the conference room were on that list and whether they had arrived here to help or to finish something. Then she went back to Strand's room and she said, "I need you to tell me specifically what you need from me, not in general terms. Specifically, because I am about to make some decisions that I cannot unmake." Strand looked at her. She said, "I need the module to reach the Senate Armed Services Committee Staff Director. Her name is Patricia Wool. Not through official channels, not through any chain of command. Directly, in person, with documentation of how the module was recovered and who has had access to it since recovery." Haugen said, "That's a specific name." Strand said, "I've had 14 months to think about who could receive this without it disappearing." Haugen said, "You've known about Wool for 14 months? Strand said, "I've known about Wool for 11 years. She was a JAG officer when I was enlisted. She told me something once. She said the thing about bureaucracies is that they protect themselves first and the mission second, and the only way to change that is to go around the bureaucracy entirely. I have spent 14 months building a record that cannot be discredited. I need someone to take it. Somewhere. It cannot be buried." She paused. She said, "I need it to be you because you're the only person in this building who asked about me before you asked about the rifle." Hagen thought about her career. She thought about 22 years and what they had cost and what they had built, and she thought about what she was being asked to do, which was to remove classified material from a federal installation and transport it outside any established chain of command to a congressional staffer. And she thought about the range of legal and professional consequences that action could produce. She thought about that for approximately 40 seconds. Then she said, "I know how to get off this installation without using the main gate." The men in the conference room waited for 6 hours before anyone told them the patient wasn't taking visitors. By that time, Haugen was in a rental car on I-10 East with the data module in a waterproof case in the bag on the passenger seat, and her personal cell phone, the one with the GPS chip she couldn't disable, was in the top drawer of her desk back at the installation. She had left it playing a podcast, something ambient. She didn't know why she thought that would matter. It probably didn't. She did it anyway. She called Patricia Wohl from a gas station payphone outside of Tallahassee at 2:40 in the afternoon, using a number she had written on her forearm in ballpoint pen based on Strand's instructions. And when Wohl answered on the second ring, Haugen said, "Was given your name by someone who said she's known you for 11 years, and I'm holding something that belongs in front of your committee, and I have maybe 6 hours before someone figures out where I'm going." There was a pause on the other end. Then Wohl said, "Who gave you this number?" Haugen said a name. Wohl was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Where are you?" The documentation that Patricia Wohl's office began processing 40 hours later covered 23 ghost contracts, $911 million in fraudulent disbursements, and the names of 41 individuals. 11 of them active military officers, 7 of them current or former defense contractors, 9 of them connected to 3 organizations that appeared repeatedly in the disbursement records, and 14 of them in positions that gave them partial oversight over the very programs they had corrupted. The name of the senior officer Strand had trusted was on the list. It was not near the bottom. The investigation that followed was not immediate, and it was not simple, and it was not the kind of clean institutional reckoning that makes for a satisfying resolution in a 2-hour film. Institutions do not reckon cleanly. They absorb and deflect and slow walk and negotiate, and the truth, when it finally surfaces partially and over time, in ways that are frustrating to people who understand what the truth contains. But it surfaced. It surfaced because Reva Strand had spent 14 months building a record that could not be discredited, and because she had held that record for 11 hours without releasing it, and because a commander named Bridget Haugen had noticed on the morning of the second day that 2 men had arrived and asked about the rifle before they asked about the woman. That detail, that one specific detail, Strand would say later in the brief statement she gave to investigators before she declined to give any further statements. The thing about a well-constructed deception is that it requires consistency across every element. Most people maintain the important elements and let the small ones slip. The small ones are where it lives. The small ones are where you find it. She was in a medical facility in Virginia when she said it. She had been there for 3 weeks. Her hands had mostly stopped shaking. She had been offered reassignment, relocation, and a formal commendation that she declined. She kept the rifle. No one pushed back on that. There was, in the end, no legal basis for anyone to push back on it. The rifle was unregistered in any system, unattributed to any program, carrying no markings that connected it to any government entity. It existed, officially, as a recovered item of unknown provenance. It was hers the way the record was hers, because she had built it, and because she had held on to it when every reasonable physiological metric said she should have let go. She hadn't. Some things, once you've decided to carry them, you carry.